Good afternoon, and welcome to this afternoon's Plus You conversation. I'm Jonathan Reckford, CEO of Habitat for Humanity International. It is my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Richard Haass, President of the Council on Foreign Relations, for a conversation I've been looking forward to for a long time. Dr. Haass has a distinguished background, having served multiple administrations in both parties, and is longtime President of the Council on Foreign Relations. I'd encourage our audience members to look to his bio to see all the impressive things he has done and the important work of the Council as well, which I have been a proud member of for many years. Richard, welcome. Richard, thank you. Your recent book, The Bill of Obligations, and Hold and Share, calls for Americans to re-envision the very notion of citizenship and embrace the civic responsibilities required to live in a thriving democracy. At Habitat, while our primary mission is housing, we have seen firsthand how the process of bringing people together to serve in communities in this country has built relationships that break down differences and can be in many ways the antidote to the polarization that we're seeing in such a widespread way today. During our conversation, I'd love to focus on the Bill of Obligations you outline and key actions our audience can implement in our own lives. You suggest that obligations are the fuel for a thriving democracy. I would certainly agree that I think we're all quick to claim our rights and less quick to claim our responsibilities that come with that. Could you just tell us what made you want to write the book and share the 10 obligations you've identified in the book?
Well, thank you, Jonathan, and I hope the sound is okay now. I'd say you and I were in violent agreement, but that would violate one of the obligations. So I'll say we're in nonviolent agreement. Look, what originally brought me to this idea was through the back door of foreign policy. And increasingly, I came to the conclusion that the United States could not carry out a persuasive, much less a consistent foreign policy if we were in domestic turmoil, if we were divided against ourselves so we couldn't pass necessary legislation to meet our challenges here at home, if worse than that, we were at war with ourselves, our allies wouldn't be able to trust us, our enemies wouldn't be deterred by us. So I came to this through the back door of national security. I also spent several years as the U.S. envoy to Northern Ireland and went back again as an international mediator. And I've seen what political differences, the damage they can do to a modern society. And the notion that it can't happen here is unfortunately wrong. It can happen here. I think it's important not to be overly sanguine. In 3 years, we're going to mark the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. But democracies are not necessarily permanent. And the biggest threat to democracies tends not to be external invasion. It tends to be erosion from within. And my idea is rather simple, and you got at it right away, that rights are essential. I understand the centrality of rights to the American experiment. The Bill of Rights was necessary just to get the Constitution ratified. Several states required a Bill of Rights offering protections to states and individuals. My argument, though, is if we all had all of the rights we wanted, but to use Lincoln's phrase, if our unfinished work were somehow finished, and there was no longer a gap between the rights we promised and the rights we delivered, American democracy would still be vulnerable. The reason's simple. Rights inevitably come into conflict. Take a mother's right to choose versus the rights of the unborn, or someone's right to bear arms pursuant to the Second Amendment, someone else's right to safety, and one could go on and on. So we need a way of dealing with the fact and the unavoidable reality that rights collide. And the only way I could think of doing it was by raising up, not reducing the role of rights, but raising up the role of obligations that you and I have to one another as fellow citizens, obligations that both of us have to this government and this country of ours. And the obligations can be everything from the most basic, to be informed, then to be involved, issues like civility, nonviolence, to respect norms and so forth. And then I put special emphasis on one thing that I'm sure is near and dear to your heart, the importance of narrowing the gap between individuals and government and getting individuals involved in public service. which I think is important. I also put a large emphasis on the teaching of civics in our schools. I think it's the best and perhaps only way to pass on the narrative of what makes any democracy, in particular American democracy, so valuable and what is required for it to succeed. So, we can go through the obligations in any detail you want, but I think the biggest takeaway is simply that as citizens, if we want this democracy of ours to endure, we have to start thinking more about, again, what we owe one another, what we owe this country, rather than simply what we believe we are owed.
Thank you so much, Richard. We were talking just beforehand. I think we're in an anti-institutional moment. Maybe there's always elements of that, but technology has exacerbated the impact of that, where it's much easier to tear things down than to build them up. And I do think people assume they can have all the benefits of a stable democracy while breaking down some of the fabric of the institutions that support it. There are so many places love to maybe start with get involved. That's something deep in the ethos of Habitat for Humanity. When you think about get involved, what does success look like from your perspective? What should a citizen be doing from a get involved perspective to be a participant in our democracy?
You're right. Involvement's central. Democracy is not a spectator sport. I'd say the only precursor I'd set to getting involved is getting informed. Thomas Jefferson, made a point saying that democracy rests on a foundation of an informed citizenry. And Ronald Reagan, much more recently, argued that yes, we want patriotism, but it must be an informed patriotism. It's not enough for people to act in the name of this country. They've got to, again, understand what are its traditions, what are its values, what are its obligations, lest they do things in the name of patriotism. That would be anything. But getting involved is central. The most basic form of involvement is voting. I mean, the recent midterm elections, I find it head scratching or head shaking or worse that something like 55% of eligible voters did not vote. And this is at a time that we're making critical decisions for the present and future of our country. So, again, the floor, if you will, involvement has got to be voting. But there's any number of other ways to get involved in the political process, from working for those who are running to office to manning polls to educating voters about the choices to actually serving in government, working in campaigns. Again, there's an enormous menu. There's joining the military. There's other forms of public service. So the list is long about ways of getting involved. And also, by the way, there are things that could be done that we shouldn't even think of, or maybe we don't think of as politics. The people who give sermons every week in churches, and synagogues and mosques, I would argue they have the obligation, among other things, to talk about the importance of civility, to talk about the importance of not allowing any political dispute spill over into violence. They have an obligation to argue that people should remain open to compromise. Who better than a religious authority could quote scripture to talk about our responsibility to be our brothers and our sisters' keepers and to do things for one another, both because it's the right thing to do, but it's also a smart thing to do. It improves the quality of the society we live in. It encourages behaviors that might come directly to our benefit. So this is, everybody's got a role to play here. Parents, teachers, journalists, business leaders, religious leaders. This is not going to be solved from the top down by a president or by a Congress. It's going to be solved or fixed from the bottom up by all of us.
Thank you, Richard. It's something we've been very interested in for a long time at Habitat has been national service. And we've always, every year we hire hundreds of young women and men who serve across the country in a variety of roles and leverage volunteers. We see that as the fact that we now have and you talk about it in your book, we have an all-volunteer army. And so increasingly, we've lost that chance that some countries, I used to live in Korea, it became a unifying thing that everyone had that shared service and was forced to spend a couple of years living with, working with people who are different and from different socioeconomic or other backgrounds in their country. Probably a stretch that we will get all the way there, but your thoughts on what that might look like in terms of encouraging more people to both serve in government, as you wrote, and other kinds of national service?
Well, first of all, I think it's important to underscore what you said. It's a fantastic way to bring Americans together who would otherwise be separated by what? Geography, levels of educational attainment, religion, color, politics, you name it. Right now, I worry that everybody, or not everybody, so many of us are living in our separate information systems, almost ecosystems. So we need to bring people together and also to create some overlapping or common experiences. This is a country based on ideas and ideals, and it's important, I think, to bring Americans together. I don't think we ought to make it mandatory, Jonathan, because I think that would be a political distraction. We'd be spending all of our time debating that. So we've got an all-volunteer force for the military. Several states, I think California may be in the lead, have incentivized public service. I can imagine states designating certain already existing forms of service or creating them, paying people a decent salary, and say for a year or two, young people, ideally between high school and college, would do that. I could then imagine that employers would give them benefits, say, hey, we're more likely to hire those who have done this the same way now. They advantage veterans. Or colleges could say, hey, we will move you up our charts when it comes to making admissions decisions if you've had a year or two of this kind of experience. It could be a great way to impart skills. There's a training dimension. There even could be a civics dimension directly to this. So I actually think this is one of those public ideas. And I think it could happen at the national level, it could happen at the state level, or both. I don't think it's a partisan issue in particular, as best as I can tell from talking to people on the Hill. And I just think it would also reduce some of the gap, not just between Americans and other Americans, but between Americans and government. It would maybe open a few eyes saying, hey, to do something in the public space can be really interesting, really important, and really satisfying.
It's important, and I think we've certainly observed really complex things require multi-sector solutions, and it's really, you can't do much of anything at scale with at least not partnering with the government. The government at minimum sets the enabling environment and sort of the rules of the game. You already mentioned, but I'd love to drill a little deeper in terms of staying open to compromise. That is something where can feel like either party, your highest risk might be actually going against the orthodoxy of your own party as opposed to going up against the other party, and compromise has become a dirty word. Could you share a little more of why that's dangerous and what we could do better about it?
First of all, again, you're right. Compromise has become a dirty word, which is quite odd looking at American political history. We look at the compromises that made this country and this Constitution of ours possible. So compromise in some ways can be as American as cherry pie. It's interesting, John F. Kennedy, in the book Profiles in Courage, several of the senators he profiled for demonstrating rare political courage were people who compromised. When to do so was controversial and put their career at risk. And don't get me wrong, my position is not that one should always compromise, but I argue to be open to compromise, to consider it, and to really think it through. Okay, if I don't compromise, what are the consequences of that? Where will that leave me today, tomorrow, the day after tomorrow? If I am prepared to compromise, where am I likely to be then? And the answer then may be, well, certain compromises are worth it, others are not. I don't think there's a one size fits all situation. But in many cases, I think we get really stuck, and we tend to see compromise as somehow synonymous with unprincipled or weak. And it's just dead wrong. Again, to me, compromise is simply a choice. It's one option among many, and we ought to always be open to it simply as an option. And I would argue in many cases, it's better to get half the loaf. It's better to get something done in the right direction than to remain pure and have nothing to show for it.
No, I think we could have a whole conversation around. I think there are numerous issues where you could have a substantial majority of the country agree, but our political system seems incapable of finding that common ground. The another one I was very struck. Obviously, it resonates with Habitat. Is promote the common good, and that sort of sense of in our internal language we talk about mission before me, but at a civic or national sense, you know. Thinking about the common good. Could you unpack that a little bit what you mean by that?
Well, I like your phrase "mission before me." That really resonates. I think in some cases it's the right thing to do. I think every now and then doing the right thing is important. When we do that in many ways in our lives, I'd like to think philanthropy, charity is a form of that. But also, there's an element of self-interest here. We want this society to be as productive as possible, as healthy as possible, as safe as possible. Well, that requires investing in our fellow citizens. We shouldn't assume that things will turn out ideally if we simply leave them alone, or that we can somehow shield ourselves from the consequences. I'll probably lose some people here, but I think, for example, our reactions to COVID-19, to the pandemic, too many people were stuck on their rights not to wear masks or not to get vaccinated, and I don't think they were either thinking enough about their own vulnerability to people not wearing masks or not being vaccinated, or their own responsibility to one another, to their family members, to their neighbors, to people who are their colleagues in the office. And so I think, again, there's looking out for your fellow citizen. Again, it has both a value dimension, but also a practical dimension. And it turns out it's good for us often to do the right thing.
Absolutely. If an area that's near and dear for us, and I was pleased that you referenced it, because I think when we think about the common good, ultimately the level of economic divide as well as political divide is probably unsustainable. And I appreciated that you raised that in the book. One of the things we've seen is the American dream is split. And Raj Chetty's data was so compelling that children from low-income families who grew up in mixed-income neighborhoods still had that relatively good social mobility. But too many children in our country grow up in concentrated areas of poverty, and there's virtually no social mobility. They are trapped in an ongoing cycle of poverty. And that's, intentional choices created that. And how do we ensure that actually opportunity is a real thing for everyone?
Look, couldn't agree more. Equal opportunity and real opportunity can't just be slogans. Condoleezza Rice, my former colleague, good friend, often points out that show me someone's zip code, and I can tell you all you need to know about the quality of public education. And we may speak about equal opportunity, but the fact is that public schools, which for most Americans are the only affordable or available academic opportunity, if the quality of public schools varies dramatically, as it does, in large part because of how schools are funded in this country, we may have equal opportunity in principle, but we do not have it in practice. And if we don't want issues of economic inequality to become really, really divisive in this country, we have got to make sure that economic opportunity is real. My own analysis is that Americans don't expect everybody to be at an equal level. What they do expect is that people have opportunities, and and education has traditionally been the greatest ladder of advance in this country. So yeah, I feel really, really strongly about it. I can get fairly radical and also make the case against things like legacy admissions. I've got certain strong views on the ability to pass on too much wealth to the next generation. I worry a little bit that we're conferring too many stark advantages on certain people, who are born into certain situations. But whatever, I still think the biggest emphasis ought to be on making sure that opportunity is real. I think people are content with absolute gains if they're real, even if the relative positions remain unequal. But as long as they can see progress in their own lives and believe that their children will realize more progress yet, I think people basically work within the system. When they give up hope, that kind of progress is realistic or really possible, then I think we've got a massive problem on our hands.
I absolutely agree. And it's something, our particular lens is housing, which connects. So it's not just do you have adequate housing, which connects to education, health, and other pieces, but then where that housing is such an important piece. And in a way, it ties to some of the civic engagement because I often give the example, I grew up in a small college town that was very much a middle-class town when I was a child. So everyone went to school together, everyone worshiped together in whatever their faith was. You fast forward 40 years later, and it's an upper middle-class college town. And so you have you have mixing across race and faith, but everyone is upper middle class or middle class. And so you've created a divide that I think goes against. And then if you layer that with reduced civic participation, I think it exacerbates it. Let's talk a little about the global piece. Habitat works in 71 countries. We have seen over and over again the devastating impact of poor government or undemocratic behaviors. And in fact, the shrinking space for civil society is one of the largest threats we're seeing in country after country right now. I think about Haiti, I think about Venezuela, I think about Nicaragua. You can look at parts of Eastern Europe. We can certainly look at obviously the war and all that comes with it. Talk a little bit about the downside if we continue down this path. And then I want to end on a more upbeat note. But
Oh, good. Before we drink hemlock,
exactly.
Look, the trends are not good. For a long time after World War II, after the end of the Cold War 30 odd years ago, the trends are in the right direction. There were more democratic countries and more people living in more democratic countries than had been the case previously. Over the last, I'm guessing 15 or so years, 20 years, the trends have reversed. We're seeing more countries become less democratic. Some are slipping over into the authoritarian side. To me, the best word is illiberal. We're seeing more and more countries begin to not respect the rights of journalists or business people. We're seeing in Mexico the attack the president is leading on the electoral oversight authority. We're seeing Israel attempts to weaken the role of an independent judiciary. Hungary's kind of the poster child for liberalism. Maybe Turkey's a close number two. And we ourselves, in some cases, are suffering from that. So I worry about the trends in liberalism. I think there's lots of reasons why. I think probably because of everything from economic issues to the pandemic and so forth. I also think, though, in this country, our ability to be an advocate for democracy, civil society, human rights suffers when people look at the United States and don't see a shining city on a hill, see something that is not the United States they perhaps remember when they studied here as a young person, see a country that's, again, divided, unable to meet its challenges, in some ways more violent than it was. So I think the best thing we can do to promote civil space and civil society around the world is put our own house in order, almost in the physician heal thyself school. And then if we do that, the example we set, I think will have a lot of resonance. But right now, we can talk the talk all we want, but unless we walk the walk, I don't think we're going to be terribly persuasive.
Thank you. I would encourage, we're running out of time quickly, but we've got a few questions from the audience and welcome additional ones if one of our members asked, from your perspective, these all seem critical. Is there one obligation that seems to be the most challenging and for people who cared, how could they help?
Yeah, it's one we haven't talked about, but if I could choose one, it's probably one that will shape my life going forward a bit, is to promote the teaching of civics in our schools. To cut to the chase, Jonathan, I do not believe a young man or woman, boy or girl, should be able to graduate from high school or college in this country without taking a civics course. We wouldn't let them graduate from school not being able to read or deal with computers or talk or think critically. Why in the world would we allow them to leave campus or leave a school and not be prepared to be participating citizens in this democracy, which depends upon civic participation? So if I could choose one thing to change going forward, It would be, again, civics in our schools, civics in our colleges. We could have a separate conversation about what ought to be the content of those courses, the curriculum. Obviously, that's terribly important. But one of the reasons I wrote this book was to start a national conversation about the importance of getting civics in our schools. The secondary conversation, which is close to what you all do for a mission, is to increase public service in this country.
It's so important. I was struck by your comment in the book that that our newly arrived Americans are best educated on civics, and it'd be interesting whether if all of us could pass the citizenship questionnaire, but that is a baseline. Trying to move to sometimes getting started is the hardest part. So you have a wonderful array of resources you mentioned in sort of the how to go deeper at the end of the book, which I would encourage our audience to follow up on. What in terms of if you were to tell this audience who lean in this direction, what would be the best first step for them to foster collaboration across divides in their own daily lives? So
there's no one way. It could just be in their own behaviors. Some of the things we've talked about, civility, compromise, talking to religious leaders where they go to church about what is said from the pulpit. Businesses, are businesses making it as easy as they should for their employees to vote? Are businesses contributing money to politicians who are undermining democracy? If so, why would they do that? Parents, we've seen all the attention about school boards. Why aren't parents emphasizing the importance of civics in the curricula of school? So I think there's lots of things that people could do in their particular lives. But again, I think the most important is to get more informed. Lots of ways to do that, from reading books like mine to reading the classics of American political history, to just staying informed, reading one or two newspapers a week. Indeed, one of the things I talk a lot about is what does it mean to get informed? And I think we've got to move away from single sourcing. If you were feeling ill and were worried you had a serious disease, no one would simply go to one doctor for one opinion. We would want to get a second opinion. Why is our democracy any less important? We should get second opinions about the important issues of our day. And again, I think it's worth the investment it would require.
That's great. It's easy to get people upset and worried about these. Maybe I'd love to end on a more positive note. What makes you hopeful as you look out and see both the need and opportunity in front of us?
What makes me hopeful, I'll say two things. One is, I see lots of examples in our history of people doing the right thing. Most recently, you had Liz Cheney or several of the secretaries of state responsible for electoral practices around the country do exactly what I advocate for, putting country before party or person. That kind of character, demonstrations of character, to me are really powerful. Or you see groups like yours, or Mothers Against Drunk Driving, or citizens in Michigan trying to change the pattern of gerrymandering, how districts are drawn. We're seeing citizen initiative in lots of ways. And then I'm seeing the response to this book. I don't say this to be self-referential, but when I talk about this book, and I've been doing it quite a lot, everywhere I go, people have a sense that something's wrong. It's resonating. They know that we've gone off track. They know that we've gone off the rails, but they also know, particularly people who are older, that this is something worth preserving, that it wasn't always this way, and they want to do something about it. So I sense the mood I get is not one of defeatism. It's not one of cynicism. It's one of possibility. There's an urgency and there's a sense of possibility, which is out there. And I'm actually really encouraged by that.
Oh, I so appreciate that, Richard. It is, I often say Habitat is not partisan, but we are political, that we have to be involved at the community level, the state level, the national level, the global level in these critical issues, because the enabling environment for all the things we've talked about is so critical. We are out of time. I would love to go on much longer. Richard, thank you for your voice and leadership in this space. Thank you for sharing your time with the Habitat family and volunteers and broader. I hope this is a conversation that will continue on for our audience, and that they will take this forward. But thank you for speaking out and sharing your wisdom with us today.
Well, Jonathan, thank you for the conversation, and in some ways more important, thank you for what you and your colleagues and your volunteers do. It's a perfect example of what's good in this country and around the world, and what we need more of. So thank you for that.
Thank you. And to our audience, thank you for joining us today. Richard Haass, Council on Foreign Relations, and I hope you will all join us in remembering we have rights and we have obligations. Thank you.